Well, hello, students. This is Dr. Ross. In this recording, I'll be giving you some guidance to help prepare you for exam one in international marketing. I'll be moving at a fairly high clip here. I'm just going to highlight some things that will help guide your studying for our exam next Thursday. So in terms of the exam itself, it will be roughly 50-50 multiple choice and short answer. There's a lot of material here, as you know, and so what I'm trying to do is narrow down your studying to the key things that I want you to focus on. So in chapter one, as you know, the chapter is all about the scope and challenge of international marketing. You ought to know for the exam what international marketing is, and so you'll see international marketing defined in chapter one. Make sure you understand that and give me that basic definition. There's also a great chart, Exhibit 1-3, that will help with that. The key thing is I want you to be able to talk about this, to be able to understand it, so that when we're talking about it, we can recognize what is controllably uncontrolled in that term and to recognize some of the examples of that. Also in chapter one, there is the topic of environmental adaptation. You should know what the meaning of that is. A real important item that we come back to time and time again that we talked about a lot in class is the notion of the self-reference criterion. You ought to understand that as well as this other term, which is similar, ethnocentrism. You ought to understand the implications of ethnocentrism and how it might influence what we do in international marketing. Also, in chapter one, there are stages of international marketing involvement. You ought to know these and be able to describe these. These are pretty fundamental to what we do here, and that's covered in the subsequent pages in chapter one, ending with global marketing. And all of these are the key things that I'd like for you to know in the first chapter. Then, as we move to chapter two, this is where we talk about the dynamic environment of international trade. Uh, and then a little bit later on in the chapter, there's a discussion on the 20th to the 21st century. Just understand this at a high level, what happened around the period of World War II that influences our approach that we take to international marketing. You should be able to understand some of the factors related to World War II and its impact on international marketing. There's a lot of discussion here um, relative to World War II. Uh, Also, you should understand what the Marshall Plan is, how overseas demand was affected by this Marshall Plan, the impact on pent-up demand, and how pent-up demand was created, various things like that. And so make sure you understand some of the key things related to the Marshall Plan included in that section of chapter two. Also, in this discussion, I want you to understand how well multinational companies have done versus companies that are only focused on their domestic market. Um, Later on, there's a balance of payments terms that you should understand. And then there's a big discussion about protectionism, which we touched on a bit in class. Protectionism is essentially where a country determines for a variety of reasons. This country's government says we are going to erect tariffs or quotas in order to preserve or protect an industry or several industries within our country to because we recognize that in a global trade situation, our particular industry or industries are not able to compete at the world level, and but they're important to who we are as a culture and as a country's society, and therefore we're going to protect those particular industries. Um, just to summarize again, I want you to understand what protectionism is and the basic logic that's there, as well as some of the illogical aspects of protectionism. You should know which of these various reasons governments use for protectionist policies, and which ones the authors of the text consider to be logical as well as illogical. There's a topic that we were just mentioning before, and we talked about it a bit in class around the notion of tariffs. Certainly, we talked about um, here in the spring of 2026, and certainly throughout 2025, um, tariffs have become sort of a common word in the U.S. vernacular in particular, based upon uh, President Trump's administration's focus on the use of tariffs. So, all that being said, you should know what tariffs are, and you should be able to give me a definition or recognize a definition of that. Also, you'll want to know the definition of quotas and import licenses and why those are important tools for um, uh, protecting a particular industry or industries within a given country. And then finally, embargoes as well. That's probably the most extreme. Then we want to understand what GATT is, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. You should know tariffs and trade. You should know the basic goals of GATT and the basic goals and functions of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Then there's the International Monetary Fund, another big group, as well as the World Bank, and you ought to know the basic goals of those organizations. So that's all from chapter two. In chapter three, we get into history and geography. We spent some time in class talking about this. Also, in chapter three, there's the topic that history is subjective, and so you should be able to understand um, the difference and the implications of uh, history as a subjective topic and history as an objective kind of topic. And then again in chapter three, there's a very interesting timeline, all of these dates. I'm not expecting you to know all of these, but there's one I want you to grab out of that, and that's the Gutenberg Bible. That in 18, or excuse me, in 1450, the Gutenberg Bible, that was obviously a, a big innovation that changed the world in many, many ways. Um, we want to understand, of course, the significance of the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. Also, you should understand the terms that we talked about a bit in class: manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine. You should understand what those are and relate those to Mexico's view of the United States. There's some really good discussion on that in this chapter. There's another term that we didn't talk a lot about, but the notion of expropriation. And that's basically where a government will take over a factory or a business or an industry, and and sort of like eminent domain. It basically, the government says, well, we're seizing this business and now it belongs to us. So make sure you understand that. Of course, there was a significant discussion about geography. You ought to know what the significance of geography is to international marketing and how that influences our ability to successfully or unsuccessfully do international marketing. Also, in this chapter, there's a discussion about the dynamics of global population trends. You ought to understand this at a high level. And continuing, there's also a discussion of rural and urban migration. You should understand why we would care about that topic. Um, Additionally, in this chapter, we talk about population decline, aging, and disease. You'll need to understand which countries are most impacted by that, and there are some countries that are real standouts in that area. And then the final item in that chapter I want you to know about is worker shortage and immigration. Of course, that is a hot topic today and has been for several years. So you want to understand why that's significant and how those two topics work together or tied together. So that's the last part that I want you to focus on in chapter three. Moving on to chapter four, cultural dynamics and assessing global markets. Um, in chapter four, there's a concept right in the sort of in the beginning of the chapter around agents of change. Make sure you understand what the authors are saying about that, and then culture's pervasive impact. And then going on in chapter four, we're going to come back again to culture. This is sort of the first introduction of that topic. We want to make sure we understand how culture impacts what we do in international marketing. Also, there is a really neat chart, Exhibit 4.4 in chapter four. The big thing I want you to pull out from this is that these are the origins of culture and understand these big four things that are, in fact, the origins of culture. And then moving on to social institutions at the beginning of the discussion, where the authors define and they list what the various social institutions are. You should know these different institutions and know their relative importance. In other words, what is the most important compared to the others, and how do they seem to impact culture? All right, and then moving on as well in chapter four, under the discussion on corporations, pay particular note to the role of corporations in innovation. Innovation's something that, of course, we talk a lot about in marketing. Peter Drucker, the probably one of the most famous management consultants, said that really the two most important um, things that an organization can do to thrive is marketing and innovation. And so we, of course, are continue to be keenly focused on the role of innovation. Um, Another aspect here is to look at how host data indexes as we go through the course and being able to appreciate the differences in cultures around, for example, excuse me, the aspect of individualism and collectivism. You need to understand that these are key ways that we evaluate a culture and make sure you understand what those two are. A couple of other important ones, power distance and uncertainty avoidance. You ought to know those measures. You don't have to know which countries are which way, although it may kind of help you remember what they are based upon the things that you're learning or already know about those particular countries. Um, Additionally, there is a good discussion in chapter four about rituals. You ought to know what the meaning of rituals are in the context of international marketing. And then moving forward, there's a discussion on cultural sensitivity and tolerance. And so understand what the authors are saying here about the importance of being attuned to these items. And then the final item in chapter four is about cultural borrowing. Make sure you understand what that topic is about. All right, so now let's go to Chapter 5, Culture, Management Style, and Business Systems. In Chapter 5, there's a discussion about required adaptation. Understand that concept and the ability to recognize or be able to recognize some of these items that are listed as a guide to adaptation. And so these are various criteria that we should be able to meet. I don't expect you to be able to list all of these, but you ought to be able to at least recognize these. And then further on in chapter 5, there is a listing of the imperatives, electives, and exclusives. Uh, so you need to know how we're using those terms here in this context and what the differences are. All right. Um, Going on further in chapter 5, um, you'll want to understand the ways that cross-cultural evaluations are represented. You see in a bulleted list beginning with Master of Destiny, you ought to understand what those things are, all these, and what all these things mean here. And a little bit further on, a couple of paragraphs, there's a discussion about fairness. These are various things in individualistic cultures, things that are issues of fairness and opportunity, and how that's important. You ought to know that that is a key hallmark of individualistic cultures. And then further on, there's a whole discussion about management styles around the world. And so authority and decision making are important aspects to understand. Um, Further on, the authors talk about top level management decisions generally found in situations where there's family or close ownership. Make sure you understand that, what the first sentence or two is talking about there. And then further on, I want you to know about how things change as businesses grow and more professional management develops. You ought to know what happens then organizationally, and then also understand management objectives and aspirations. Then there's a discussion about security and mobility. You ought to be able to relate PDI to IDV or individualism, power and distance, and individualism to this issue of security and mobility. All right, and then moving on in chapter 5, um, there is a chart in chapter 5 that I think you'll find interesting. I don't really think you need to know about this, but maybe just pay attention to this. It could help you understand the differences between low context and high context. But I'm not expecting you to be able to list out these countries. And then there is a discussion, a brief exemplar of high and low context dimension. It sort of has a discussion here that might help you remember that, but make sure you understand uh, what high-low context is um, uh, as a topic. There's also a topic on formality and tempo. Understand that some of these issues associated with that as we move around the world, you don't have to know them by country, but just understand the general concept. Further on, there's a discussion about gender bias. You ought to know and understand some of these at a high level in that area. And then as we move on, there's a whole discussion about bribery. The key thing I want you to take away from this is understanding the difference between bribery and extortion. And then also understand the differences between lubrication versus subornation, and understand what agents' fees are. And then within that as well, the different approaches and their context within ethical management behavior. Now I want to move on to, or excuse me, finally, I want you to understand utilitarian rights and justice or fairness. Okay, let's move to chapter 6. And this is on political environment, which is a critical concern. Um, Again, in chapter 6, we're talking about what we say about sovereignty of nations, and there's a discussion about the stability of government policies. Make sure you understand what and why this is important in the international marketing context. Um, then you should understand the basic forms of government. Um, there's some good discussion here. Make sure you understand those basic ideas. Then further on, there's a discussion about nationalism. You want to understand how this is manifested in different countries and various countries' behavior. What do they do and when? They have more nationalistic kinds of tendencies, and how might that impact what we can do or can't do? And furthermore, whether they're a good target for us for international marketing. All right. And then there, further on are some important terms that we'll want to know around confiscation, expropriation, um, and domestication. Make sure you understand those. Um, and then also, I want you to understand or be able to focus on what is local content laws. Um, Further on in the chapter, I want you to understand about lessening political vulnerability, and then terms like joint ventures, licensing, and franchising. Planned domestication, make sure you know what that is. So that's all for chapter 6. Now, looking at chapter 7, that's all about the international legal environment. I'm not going to make you understand, you're not going to make you understand all this, but I am going to ask you to understand uh, the international legal environment at a high level. Um, there are different legal systems. What were their origins? And so that you can have an understanding of common law versus code law, Islamic law, and Marxist socialist kind of tenets. Some of the key things that are important for us in doing business around the world, international dispute resolution. Um, Remember, we talked in class about the law of the sea and does where do countries' sovereignty extend, to what extent beyond their coastline. Also, understand how to deal with basic disputes, conciliation and arbitration, and then litigation. You should also know the typical sequence of using these different approaches. What do we do first, and what do we do next, and what do we do next, kind of thing. And then there's a good discussion around the area of intellectual property and protecting our property rights. Then there's this term prior use and the term registration. Make sure you understand the difference between those two because different countries approach those in different ways. Domain names around the internet, cyber law, um, and so that you can understand what domain names is about and what cyber squatters are. Further on, there's a discussion about jurisdiction of disputes and validity of contracts. And then, excuse me, there's a line that says two of the most troubling areas are what the two of the most troubling areas are, and want you to understand what those are and what is the main question that is having to be dealt with there, making those determinations. And then also, there's the discussion about green marketing, understanding what that is, understand which countries are particularly focused on green marketing, and laws and regulations related to that. And also, there's an important concept here that everyone needs to know in the U.S. is that U.S. laws still apply to host countries. So you'll want to understand the basics of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, um, and also U.S. antitrust laws that apply in foreign markets. Um, you'll need to understand about that idea. The last item is determining export requirements. Basically, what I want you to take away from here is who does what in the relationship? Whose responsibility is it to determine if a license is required as it relates to export? So that's the last item I have on that. You'll also see toward the end of the chapter, um, um, uh, in the bullets that follow around uh, export licenses. So that's all I have on chapter 7. It's the last item I have for guidance on this exam. God bless you as you get ready for this exam. Please let me know if you have any questions about these concepts or anything that I've said in this guidance so that I can help you with it. Just grab me after class, send me an email, and I'll try to get an answer back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks a lot.